Please welcome our chapel speaker, Spencer Tillman.
Thank you, Stephen. It's one of those rare occasions where I get a chance to hear someone say nice things about me. In a house with 4 beautiful daughters and a wife of 30 years, that isn't always the case. Just last night, for example, I had the pleasure of having dinner with friends, and I've been on the road. This is a moment of transparency. I know this is the Lord's day, but this is a moment of transparency here for a minute. So I get back to the room, and I decided after being on the road for 14 of the last 15 days, I'd call my wife up. And I just missed her. She was coming back from a trip with the girls. And I got on the phone, and I'm just, again, being transparent with you. And I got in my deep, very white voice, and I said, Rita, I'm thinking about the last time we made Passion Love. I'm getting a little excited. She says, who is this? And I said, and that's the kind of stuff that I deal with all the time in my household. They never let me off the hook, right? So it's tough to do it. So when someone says something nice about you, it's kind of cool to hear that from time to time. It is a pleasure to be here this morning. Our time is brief, so I want to move with all due haste to bring a little bit of a word of encouragement to us today. But in the process of doing that, I want to make sure that we focus on a couple of things. Years ago, a greenhorn in the business, Keith Jackson, the legendary sports broadcaster, gave me some sage advice, 2 pieces of items. The first one was, say what you see as an analyst, and number 2, be brief. And I plan to do both of those this morning. But in the process and in setting this up, I want to share something that happened to me recently in New York City as an introduction. So I'm at the corner of 57th and 7th. And if you've ever been in New York City, you know in the particular time of day that we're talking about in the afternoon, traffic is always heavy. And there's just this wave of humanity waiting to cross the street. So I'm sitting there, and I'm in the process of doing an interview with the local affiliate on the radio. And unfortunately, my famous 4G network wasn't really working up to the speed that it should have been working. So I find a stationary spot so that I could get a steady signal, right? So I've got the signal in. But I'm at the 4-way stoplight there, and I'm just thinking to myself, you know what, I can't move because we're in a break, and if we come back, and then I'm not there, and then they lose the signal, they'll never have me back as a guest, yada, yada, yada. So I make the executive choice to stand there and just wait, right? Bad decision. I stand there, and about 10,000 people are behind me waiting for the light to change. So it goes through the progression, red, yellow, green, and I don't move, but everybody else moves. I can feel them rushing behind me. And about maybe 2.5 second beat, I get poked in the back, and I turn around, and there's this lady about this big. I'm not the tallest guy in the world. I'm only about 5'10 and a half, 5'11", and she's shorter than I am, and she looks at me, and with this dead stare and in this deep Irish brogue, she goes, is there a particular shade of green you're waiting for, young man? And I thought to myself, after uncontrollably laughing for about a full minute, I said that was the greatest line I've ever heard. I finally came to my wits and I said, you know what, I'm going to use that line in an upcoming speech that I have. And that's our introduction, because that lady gave me some sense of where to start off in communicating with you the importance that we move with some due haste when the crisis and the circumstance dictates that. What I want to do over the next 15 minutes or so is talk to you from the subject, if I'm giving this title subject. It would be the art and the grit of responding in a crisis. I want to consider what the Bible has to say about operating and functioning in difficult situations. Along the way, I want to accentuate the attributes and the qualities of the highly successful leader in the 21st century. And to do that, we're going to consider a first century example of someone who led in a highly effective manner and remains a model for us even today. The reading came from the book of Psalms, one of my favorites, along with the book of Hebrews. I love the book of Hebrews because it is the book of better things. In it, God is laying out an exegetical comparison, a critical comparison between Judaism and Christianity. Not to negate the order, because the book of Galatians declares unto us that the law was the schoolmaster, right? That so eloquently and intellectually teaches unto us the perfection of the grace of God. Among many things, we come to know that we are the ecclesia, the called out ones. But we are more than just called out, we are consecrated. Consecrated in order that we might become living, breathing, pulsating bodies of priests and priestesses who are prepared to show forth, push forth the blessings of He who has delivered us from the dark place into a marvelous light. And oh, what a marvelous light it can be. It's the kind of light that people say at this Western Conservative Conference, these people have a passion for this nation. and want to see the type of change that brings us back to that mantle that we have occupied for the bulk of our 240 years as a nation. But ultimately, when we don't, and we miss the opportunity to move with all due haste to affect the change in our communities, we fail to push forth the best of what it means to be created in the image of God. Our people, our cities, our state, and the nation indeed can be thrown into political, moral, and socioeconomic disrepair. We are indeed living in times where the need to achieve objectives are immediate. The obstacles between those objectives are formidable. The obstacles available to us are limited, and time appears to be running out. In football, we call these red zones. For you football fans in here, you know it's the 20-yard line into the end zone. And there are a host of reasons why we call it the red zone, but one of the things that's the takeaway here, and as we set this up, is all we need to know about that is that several things are taking place. I gave you the characteristic. You know you're in a red zone when the need to achieve an objective is immediate, the obstacles are formidable, the options available are limited, and time is running out. The question is, are we prepared to diagnose what the issues are, come up with a strategy that gives us the best chance to succeed given the context, and are we willing to execute the plays? That's what it comes down to. In football, as we said, we've called this the red zone. Do you know that the teams that win the most amount of games are those that have the highest percentage of scoring when they're in this critical place called the red zone? And I would submit to you today that what is true for what happens on the football field is true for this nation. It's true for businesses. It's true for families. True for organization. Epictetus said it best, the great Greek philosopher. The crisis doesn't make the person. It merely exposes what's already there. And our nation is at a critical juncture where we can learn from a 21st century or a first century example here in the 21st century of how to lead. And the formula is not that complicated because we can see it in 2 Chronicles 7:14. You may be familiar with it. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, seek my face, then will I hear from heaven and I will heal their land. That is a promise, but that promise has a premise. God gives us a pathway out. He warns us and encourages and admonishes us in his word that there is no temptation that is overtaking us except such as is common to man. But God is faithful and will not allow us to be tempted beyond what we are able, but with that temptation will provide a means of escape so that we may be able to bear it. So the scriptures are replete with examples of how to turn things around. The question is, do we have the will to engage? Now, you guys are outliers in this room. What I'm here to do is just to encourage and admonish you when you go back and you see those people who are deciding whether or not to engage and be active participants as opposed to detached spectators. We're going to take this narrative of this lesser known prophet in scripture back as our example. So, Mike, get ready to tag this thing with me. I want the crowd to take a listen here and tell me if you can recognize who this individual was who found himself in a classic leadership challenge in first century. Mike?
In the month of Kislev in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel city of Susha, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, "Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven.
Who is that? Nehemiah, right? You know the story, his narrative. His brother Hanani comes from 1,000 miles away to share with him that the gates and walls of their town, Jerusalem, have been torn down. They've been razed to the ground. And what does Nehemiah do? He responded like anyone who is threatened when their core values are at risk. He leverages his influence with King Artaxerxes to do three things. He asked him for permission to go back and reclaim Jerusalem and rebuild it. And I love it, and let me just be inside the family here a little bit. All the black preachers I know, they get hyped when they preach that, and they get excited when they can talk about the part where he built it in 52 days. And they get really excited about it. But what we really need to focus on is the fact that if you read the narrative close, he literally stayed there 12 years reconstituting the people. That gives you some sense of the challenge that's ahead of us and why it is so important that we not faint in good doing when we're trying to affect change for the kingdom and for a nation by extension. Nehemiah's example is relevant today for myriad reasons. When you look at what he did in this first century example, he faced every particular type of challenge any leader in the 21st century would face. Innuendo, intimidation. Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem tried to lure him down by the plain of Ono so that they could kill him. They didn't want to sit and meet with them and have fun. In their minds, a strong Jerusalem made them weak. They were the kingpins of the era. So what they wanted to do is to make sure the one who was going to reclaim Jerusalem would not be in a position to do the same, so that they can continue to manipulate. Does that narrative sound familiar? Some of our politicians do that. But Nehemiah had a purpose. He had a goal. He had a focus. He was intent on doing it. So much so in rebuilding Jerusalem that I believe as you look at the narrative, it's clear that he understood the Torah, the Old Testament. He knew that there would be a place for you Judeo-Christians in the crowd where Jesus would emerge. And he knew that if he did not do what he was called to do, there would be no place from which Jesus could emerge. So when people start to evaluate and they ask the question, why are you so passionate about coming to this conference or going back to your respective cities and states and engaging in such a way that produces substantive change? Let's move back with that narrative that Nehemiah also moved with, a sense of awareness that if I don't do my part, the literal foundations of not just my generation, not just this epoch, but humanity as it stands and as we know it today is at stake if I don't do what I'm called to do. Nehemiah understood he was in a red zone. But more importantly, he was able to move from cognitive understanding of the pressures. We get it. We see what the circumstances are today. But he moved and fixed his will to move from cognitive understanding to behavioral transformation. That is, where the truth of the situation dictates what we do, who we associate with, where we go, the things that we invest our time and effort and energy. And when there is alignment with these areas, change is on the way. Nehemiah understood that. The first principle, if you look at his narrative, he fixed his will to go back. Again, he used his influence to ask King Artaxerxes for permission to go, protection to travel the Trans-Euphrates, because it was a dangerous proposition. You could get killed. And then he asked for a writ along with that. And then when I got to Jerusalem, I needed to be able to fix it. So he gave him permission from Asaph, who was overseeing the royal forest, to do what he needed to do to rebuild it. He had everything he needed. But first of all, he had to fix his will to go. As we face the challenges moving ahead, as we move toward this election season, we'll have choices to make. And those choices will be predicated on decisions that politicians, for good or bad, have made before us. And it's incumbent upon us to fix our will like Nehemiah did and align our core values with it and act in a way that's consistent with those values we know God would have us act in. It's not an option. It's our responsibility. As Christians, it's our responsibility as citizens of this great nation. The three principles: he fixed his will. Number two, he understood a very important principle, the principle of creativity and destruction. I can't get this image out of my mind of the Twin Towers in New York City. For years that I would fly in, I would see them touching and reaching the sky. And since 2001, and I even wore it before then, I've worn my American flag because it's a touch point for me. That was a seminal moment. It changed the way I saw the world and my place in it. And so this is just a small symbol of how we express that. But that's part of the process of moving from cognitive understanding to behavioral transformation. The will was fixed to affect change. Number two, the principle of creativity and destruction, as evidenced by what he did, he was able to marginalize anybody who represented a threat to the reclamation of Jerusalem. As I said earlier, he refused a meeting with Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. He strategically placed people in positions around and near their home, as opposed to dispersing them in areas where perhaps they didn't share a core value for that particular task. He was understanding the art of his leadership, but he also understood the grit of it as well. There was a portion of the leadership challenge where he was literally building with a shovel in one hand, and he challenged those that were laboring with him to have a sword in the other hand. He was ready in season and out of season to do what was required to achieve the objective. Such is the characteristics of the leaders that we need to be today. And the last deal, and if you're writing, I would love to leave this with you in the last 7 minutes that I have with you. There is a template as I begin to study the life of Nehemiah that I think we all should leave here and implement in our lives every single day. I call it the vector sum of focus. VECTOR, vector sum of focus. It's a very simple concept, a very simple principle. The medical term is a little bit different, but most of you may be familiar with it from the aeronautical sense. The speed and distance of an object as it moves toward its destination. The V stands for values. Values determine the object of our focus. How do you know that Nehemiah valued Jerusalem? No one would have risked what he risked to go back and build Jerusalem. It was a jeopardous situation for him to go to King Artaxerxes and ask in the first place. He could have had his head chopped off. He didn't know what his response was going to be. But when our core values trump all of those consequences, we do it anyway. It was that important to him. Values determine the object of our focus. E is energy. Energy will naturally flow if it's connected to your core values. I'm getting a little excited up here today because it's my personality. That's the way I'm wired. Nobody has to coerce me to do this. My wife knows where I am typically. I'm in my studio cutting audio, or I'm at the television station in New York, wherever I am. But you better believe I'm going to bring passion to whatever I do. I don't spend time doing things that I'm not energetic about. So if we're connected to our core values, the energy will naturally flow. C, courage, not the absence of fear, the acknowledgement of it, but the willingness to move ahead anyway. I remember growing up as a kid, the Cowardly Lion. Remember that scene in The Wizard of Oz where he gets to the wizard and they give him about everything that they need? Dorothy's going to get her shoes, and the Tin Man's going to get his heart, and the Scarecrow's going to get his brain. And then when the lion gets up there, he asks him something, and the wizard says, "Silence!" And he turns and hightails it down the hall and dives out the window. As a 9-year-old kid, can I tell you, my dad was on the couch having dozed off from a hard day's work, and I hit him, and I said, "No!" And my dad about scared the bejesus out of him. I'm just flat out telling you. He says, "What's wrong with you, boy?" I said, "Where's he going?" He said, "What do you mean? Who's going? Where is he going?" I said, "The lion. Where's he going?" He said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "The lion," and I explained to him. My thought was, you have navigated flying monkeys, lilies and fields, putting you to sleep, and you get to the one individual that can help you get what you want, and you're going to turn and hightail it and run away? Are you kidding me? Is that all it takes? That was going through my mind as a 9-year-old kid. I couldn't believe it. Courage, not the absence of fear, it's the acknowledgement of it, but the willingness to move ahead anyway. I remember when I was at CBS, 8 million people sitting there looking at you. Am I nervous? Yeah, but I'm prepared. I'm not going anywhere. I'm sitting here and doing what I prepared to do. We've got to be courageous, as Nehemiah was. VECT, talent. In this competitive context that we're living in, we have to have an appreciable amount of talent to separate and differentiate ourselves from those we're competing in. When I was growing up in this wonderful world that we're in, there were about 290 million people in this nation, 320 or so now. Globally, the challenge has changed. That's not our true competition. There are 7 billion people on planet Earth, according to Gallup. And of those 7 billion, 5 billion of them are adults age 15 and older. And of those 5 billion, 3 tell Gallup that they are actively full-time formally employed or seeking full-time formal employment. That is 30 hours a week or more with a steady paycheck. These are global numbers now, so the numbers of total hours worked are lesser than our 40 here. The problem is there are only 1.8 billion full-time formal jobs in the world today. That leaves a 1.2 billion shortfall of full-time formal jobs. That means job creation and education will become the 2 most important social values for the next 30 years in our nation. Every politician, every family, everyone should be concerned about these things. Nehemiah had a strategic mindset as well, and he understood what the value was. As I alluded to earlier, if Jerusalem was not in a state of repair, there would be no place from which Jesus would emerge. The implications of that moved him to a point where he was willing to do whatever was necessary to achieve purpose. His talent was leadership, and he leveraged it to the fullest. O, organization, the ability to reduce chaos from entering your daily practices. Whatever it is you're trying to accomplish, it must be organized. Speaks for itself. Resources is the R, and we're not always talking about money, although we know money is part of that process. It can be people, it can be influence. All of those things converge to create the vector sum of focus. And focus is the end game, right? You have to have focus if you're going to rebuild Jerusalem, if you're going to rebuild your cities, if we're going to get this nation back to where it deserves to be and where God, I believe, intends it to be. It has to be intentional. And unless it is, we're going to languish and perhaps even go back. Nehemiah understood all of these issues, and like we must move in our day, in his day, we must move in our day to affect the same kind of change. In the last 2 minutes I have, I want to share a couple of things about what is the action or the inaction if we don't do that. Many of us remember the story of Rip Van Winkle. You remember the narrative as a kid? I used to remember reading it. Washington Irving, our nation's first fiction writer, had in the illustrated version Rip Van Winkle, this listless individual, working his way up the Catskills where he would, of course, go for his 20-year sleep, his slumber, right? You remember that? I was really struck by the fact that, not that he slept for 20 years, because the narrative shows when he goes up, he looks at the image on the side of that inn, and it was a picture of King George III, the King of England, when he went up. He went up to sleep for those 20 long years, and when he came down, retraced his steps, on the side of that tavern, that very same building where he saw the picture of King George III, it had been replaced with a new image. You remember what it was? George Washington, first president of these United States. More significant than having slept for 20 years, Rip Van Winkle should have been aware of the fact that he completely slept through the American Revolution. All of the significant events that gave rise, Bunker Hill, shot heard around the world, eventually everything that was an outcropping of that wonderful time in our nation's history, he was bereft of any understanding. He had no capacity to have passion like a Nehemiah would, or that you would here today, trying to affect change for this nation. Those are the words that this nation should never be in a position to repeat, or the circumstances like Rip Van Winkle was. We need to remain awake through this revolution. Some of the examples that I just gave you about the statistics and the numbers in the population are impacting our kids in a profound way. So much so that the Department of Labor has declared this will be the first generation that will not eclipse their parents in terms of economic mobility. That is, moving from one socioeconomic quintile to the next as a matter of course. Every generation in our nation's 240 plus years have done better than the one that preceded them. This will be the first one that won't. There will be outliers, but because of globalization, information technology that allows people in Bangalore, India, and China to collaborate and compete for opportunities they couldn't even think about 15, 20 years ago. Things have changed, and we need to step up our game. The last challenge in the 7 seconds that I have remaining, I want to go to Nehemiah as our example, but I want you to think about what Kierkegaard said about taking the most of our times. He said, all of us must make noise on New Year's Eve to drown out the macabre sound of grass growing over our graves. It was better when we had hourglasses. The clocks deceive us. But we had to invent them because we needed the deception. For the rotating hands give us the illusion that time goes on forever. And meanwhile, we curse the hourglass because indeed, it's a constant reminder that time is truly running out. You say, Spencer, that's kind of a bummer. No. For the believer, we are to be about doing the works which he sent his son to do. He then in turn says, so send I you, and you, and you. We're armed with the promises of God. The question is, will we respond to the challenge? May God bless you, may God bless America, and may God bless the Western Conference.